She was 20 and broke. Not homeless, exactly, but close. Sleeping in a truck she didn't own. Eating one meal a day, counting quarters on the dashboard of a 1998 Ford Ranger, she'd driven 600 miles south from Minnesota with a black cat on the passenger seat and $43 in her pocket. And with $10 of that, she bought a rusted tugboat beached on a muddy riverbank along the Ohio River in southeastern Ohio. The engine was seized. The hull was orange with rust. The harbor master said it hadn't moved under its own power since 1987. But what nobody knew was that inside the hold of that old tugboat, hidden in a watertight compartment welded shut from the inside, were 14 silver ingots that hadn't seen daylight in over 90 years, and a story that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Wren Calloway found the cat 3 days before she found the tugboat. She was driving south on Route 7 along the Ohio River, somewhere between Marietta and Pomeroy in the first week of October. The leaves were turning. The river was wide and brown and slow, running between steep wooded hills that caught the afternoon light and held it. She had left the cabin on Pike Lake in northern Minnesota 4 days earlier, not because she wanted to, but because the money had run out and the truck needed a fuel pump, and the county had sent a letter about back taxes on the property she thought she'd paid. She still had the cabin. She still had Doc, the scruffy mutt who had been her companion since she was 17, but Doc was staying with Sigrid Hautala on Pike Lake, the retired schoolteacher who had become the closest thing Wren had to family, while Wren drove south looking for work. The drive south had been long and mostly silent. She had taken Route 2 across Wisconsin, then cut south through Illinois and Indiana, sleeping at rest stops, eating peanut butter and crackers, listening to AM radio stations that faded in and out as the hills rose and fell. She crossed into Ohio at Cincinnati and followed the river east, the road winding along bluffs and bottomland, past small towns with brick storefronts and church steeples and grain elevators standing against the sky like sentinels watching the water. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew the direction. She stopped at a gas station outside of Belpre to put $8 worth of fuel in the Ranger and use the restroom. When she came back out, a black cat was sitting on the hood of her truck. Not a kitten. A grown cat, maybe 2 years old, lean and angular with fur so black it looked wet even when it was dry. Yellow-green eyes. No collar, no chip, she would find out later. The cat looked at Wren, and Wren looked at the cat, and neither of them moved. Then the cat stood up, walked across the hood, jumped through the open passenger window, and sat on the seat as though it had been riding there for years. Wren stood in the gas station parking lot and said, "Okay." She named the cat Rivet. She didn't know why at first. Something hard and small and permanent. Something that holds things together. 3 days later, she was in the town of Racine, Ohio. Population 687 on the west bank of the Ohio River. She had been following a lead on a welding job at a barge repair facility in Middleport, 12 miles downriver. But the job had been filled 2 days before she arrived. She was sitting in the Ranger in the gravel parking lot of a gas station that doubled as a bait shop, looking at the river through the windshield, doing the math she had been doing for a week. $43 left. A quarter tank of gas, no job, no place to sleep that wasn't the cab of the truck. Rivet was curled on the passenger seat with his eyes half closed, his tail wrapped around his body like a question mark, unbothered by everything. An old man was sitting in a lawn chair beside the bait shop door. He was maybe 75, with a Cincinnati Reds cap and a flannel shirt buttoned to the collar and a coffee cup balanced on the arm of the chair. He had been watching Wren for 10 minutes without saying anything. Finally, he asked if she was looking for something. Wren said she was looking for work. He asked what kind. She told him she could weld, do carpentry, roofing, basic plumbing, and fix most things that were broken. The old man looked at her for a long time with the unhurried assessment of a person who had spent his life judging whether things would hold or not. His name was Virgil Hensley. He had lived in racing his entire life. He had worked on the river for 47 years, first as a deckhand on coal barges, then as a lockmaster at the Racine Locks, then as the unofficial caretaker of the municipal dock and the 3 abandoned vessels that had been sitting on the riverbank behind the volunteer fire department for longer than most people in town could remember. "There's a tugboat," Virgil said, "behind the firehouse. Been sitting there since '94. County wants it gone. They were going to scrap it, but nobody's come to haul it. You can have it for $10 if you want the headache." "What's wrong with it?" "Everything." Wren drove behind the firehouse and parked. The tugboat sat on the mud 30 feet from the waterline, canted slightly to starboard, half hidden by river birch and pokeweed that had grown up around the hull over 3 decades. It was maybe 65 feet long. The hull was steel, painted red once, now a mottled orange-brown from 30 years of rust and weather. The wheelhouse sat forward, its windows cracked or missing, the door hanging open. The smokestack was bent. The deck was covered in leaves and bird droppings and the gray dust that accumulates on things the world has forgotten about. Rivet jumped out of the truck and walked straight to the tugboat. He circled it once, sniffing the hull, then sat at the base of the ladder that led up to the deck and looked back at Wren. She climbed the ladder. The deck was solid underfoot, thick steel plate, rusted on the surface but not rusted through. She could feel it, the way Niels had taught her to feel wood. You learn to feel the difference between surface rot and structural rot. The surface tells you one thing. The structure tells you the truth. She knocked on the deck with her knuckles. Solid. She walked to the stern and looked at the towing bits, massive steel posts where the barge cables had been made fast. They were welded to the deck, and the welds were still good. She looked at the bulwarks, the railing, the engine room hatch. Everything was rusted. Nothing was gone. She climbed down and went back to the bait shop. Virgil was still in his lawn chair. She asked Virgil who she should pay. He said she could pay him, and he'd write a receipt and file it with the county, who would be glad to have the boat off their books. He pulled a receipt pad from his shirt pocket and asked her name. She told him. He wrote slowly, in careful block letters. Vessel. Tugboat. Formerly the Constance T. Boatwright, Ohio River registration, expired 1987. Sold as is, where is, for the sum of $10. He tore the receipt off the pad and handed it to her and asked if she knew anything about tugboats. She told him she didn't, but she knew about boats, and she knew about engines, and she knew about steel. Virgil nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he's heard enough. She paid him $10 from the folded bills in her jacket pocket. $33 left. A black cat, a rusted tugboat, and the beginning of something. The first week, she lived on the tugboat. She cleared the wheelhouse of debris and broken glass and spread her sleeping bag on the floor. The wheelhouse was about 8 feet by 10 feet with windows on 3 sides and a steel door that still closed and locked. Rivet claimed the captain's chair, a bolted-down swivel seat with cracked vinyl upholstery, and slept on it every night, curled into a tight black circle. The chair still turned. Wren spun it slowly one evening while Rivet sat on it, eyes half closed, unbothered, rotating like a small, dark planet. The first morning, she woke to the sound of a towboat passing on the river, the deep throb of its diesels vibrating through the steel hull of the Constance T and into her bones. She lay in her sleeping bag and listened. The sound moved slowly, east to west, pushing something heavy. She got up and looked out the wheelhouse window. A towboat the length of a football field was pushing 15 barges of coal downriver, the barges riding low in the brown water, the river curling white at the bow. A deckhand stood on the lead barge with a coffee cup in his hand, and for a moment, as the tow passed, he looked up at the beached tugboat and at Wren standing in the wheelhouse window, and he raised his cup in a gesture that was either greeting or farewell. She raised her hand back. Rivet sat on the captain's chair and watched the whole thing with his tail twitching. She spent the first 3 days assessing. She opened every hatch, climbed into every compartment, tested every surface with her hands and her knuckles and the back of a screwdriver handle. The engine room held a Detroit Diesel 671, a legendary marine engine that had powered half the tugboats on the American inland waterway system since the 1940s. It was seized solid, the cylinders fused from years of sitting with water in the block. But the block itself was cast iron, not cracked, and the mounts were good, and the shaft was still aligned in the stuffing box. The fuel tanks were empty and dry, no water contamination. The steering system was hydraulic, the lines cracked and drained, but the ram and the rudder moved freely when she put a pipe wrench on the rudder stock and turned. The electrical system was gone, corroded past saving every wire green with oxidation. But the hull was sound. 3/8-inch steel plate, riveted and welded, built in 1942 at a shipyard in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, 40 miles upriver. Built for the war. Built to last. On the fourth day, she found the compartment. She was in the hold, below the engine room in the space between the double bottoms where ballast water would have been carried when the boat was working. She was on her hands and knees with a flashlight, checking the hull plates for through rust when Rivet, who had followed her down the ladder, stopped at a spot on the port side and began pawing at the steel. Not idly. Deliberately. His claws scraped against the paint in short, insistent strokes. Wren shined the flashlight where he was scratching. There was a seam. Not a structural seam. The hull plates had seams everywhere where the steel sheets were riveted together. This was different. This was a rectangle about 2 feet wide and 18 inches tall, cut into the hull plate and welded back in place. The welds were old, thick, uneven, done by hand with a rod welder, the kind of bead pattern you see in work from the 1920s or 1930s. Someone had cut a panel out of the hull, put something behind it, and welded it shut. She went topside and found Virgil at the bait shop. She described what she'd found. Virgil took off his cap and rubbed his head. The Constance T was built in 42, but she wasn't new to the river when she got here. She was a harbor tug in the upper Ohio before the war, built for the Boatwright family who ran freight between Pittsburgh and Huntington since the 1890s. The family sold her to the Army in 42. She came back after the war and pushed coal barges until 87 when the engine finally gave out. Old Vernon Boatwright, that was the last captain, he beached her here and said he'd fix her up. Never did. He died in 91. What about before the war? Before 42? Virgil looked at her. The Boatwrights were river people, been on the Ohio since before the Civil War. They hauled everything: coal, timber, salt, ore. During Prohibition, they were rumored to haul other things too: whiskey from the hollows, Canadian liquor coming down from Lake Erie. Nobody ever proved anything. But old man Cyrus Boatwright, Vernon's grandfather, he was known to have money he couldn't explain. Built a big house on the hill above Racine in 1928. Paid cash. Wren went to the hardware store in Pomeroy, 8 miles south, and bought a cutting wheel for her angle grinder. $12. She was down to $21. She drove back to the tugboat and climbed into the hold with the grinder and a pair of safety glasses and Rivet, who sat on a pipe bracket 3 feet away and watched with his yellow-green eyes narrowed against the sparks. She cut along the weld line, working slowly, letting the cutting wheel do the work. The old welds were hard, harder than the surrounding steel, and the grinder screamed and threw orange sparks that bounced off the hull plates and died on the damp steel floor. It took 45 minutes to cut 3 sides of the rectangle. She pried the panel back with a pry bar. Behind the panel was a space about 3 feet deep, 2 feet wide, and 18 inches tall. A compartment fabricated from steel plate and welded to the hull framing, completely sealed, completely dry. Inside were 14 bars of silver, each one roughly the size of a paperback novel, stacked in 2 neat rows of 7. Each bar was stamped with a hallmark: a small eagle, the number 999, and the letters CB, Cyrus Boatwright. Wren sat back on her heels and stared. Rivet jumped down from the pipe bracket and walked to the opening and looked inside and then looked at Wren with an expression that said nothing and everything. She carried the bars topside one at a time, wrapping each one in a shop rag from the engine room. They were heavy, each one about 5 pounds, she guessed, 70 pounds total. She laid them on the deck in the October sunlight and sat beside them and tried to think clearly. She drove to the public library in Pomeroy and used the free computer. Silver was trading at $23.40 per troy ounce. A 5-pound bar of .999 fine silver contained approximately 72.9 troy ounces. At $23.40 per ounce, each bar was worth roughly $1,706. 14 bars, $23,884. She sat in the library for a long time. Rivet was in the truck in the parking lot, sleeping on the passenger seat. The library was quiet. An older woman at the circulation desk was reading a magazine. A man in his 60s was doing a crossword puzzle at a table by the window. The fluorescent lights hummed. $23,884. She had come to southeastern Ohio with $43 and a black cat and no plan, and now she was sitting in a library doing math that didn't make sense. She called Virgil from the library phone. "I found something in the compartment," she said. "Silver, 14 bars." There was a long silence. Then Virgil said, "I'll be damned. Old Cyrus. People talked about that for 80 years. Nobody ever looked in the right place." Another pause. "That boat's yours, legally. Receipt says as is, where is. Whatever's in it is yours." She found a precious metals dealer in Parkersburg, West Virginia, 30 miles south across the river. A man named Ira Solomon, who had been buying and selling gold and silver for 35 years out of a small shop on Market Street. He was in his 60s, careful and precise, with a jeweler's loop on a chain around his neck and a manner that suggested he had seen everything at least twice. He weighed each bar on a calibrated scale and tested the purity with an acid kit and recorded the numbers in a leather-bound ledger. "These are hand-poured," Ira said, turning one of the bars in the light. "Somebody melted silver and cast these in a mold. The stamp is amateur. See the way the eagle's wing is uneven. This wasn't a mint. This was a man with a crucible and a set of letter punches." He set the bar down. "The silver is genuine. .999 fine or close to it. The bars average 73.2 troy ounces each. At today's spot price, your 14 bars are worth $23,981. He looked at her over his glasses. "I'll buy them at 97% of spot. Cash. That's $23,261. Wren asked if he'd take all 14. He said he would, today, if she was selling. She looked at the bars on the counter. 14 rectangles of silver that a man named Cyrus Boatwright had poured and stamped and hidden inside the hull of a tugboat sometime in the late 1920s or early 1930s. Money from the river. Money from the hollows. Money from a time when the Ohio River was a highway and the people who worked it kept their savings where no bank could touch them. She thought about the compartment they had come from, sealed and dry for nearly a century, waiting in the dark below the waterline for someone to find them. She told Ira she'd sell 12 and keep 2. He counted $19,938 in $100 bills onto the counter and put the 2 remaining bars in a velvet bag and handed them to her. He told her she was smart to keep some. Silver doesn't forget its value the way paper does. Wren drove back to Racine with $19,938 in her messenger bag and a list in her head. She stopped at the hardware store in Pomeroy and bought welding rod, grinding discs, rust converter, marine primer, a 5-gallon bucket of marine enamel in matte black, wire brushes, a come-along winch, 200 feet of heavy chain, hydraulic fluid, and a case of the good cat food, the kind with real fish. Total, $487. She had $19,451, and she intended to spend it carefully. If you're enjoying this story, take a second and subscribe. It helps us keep making stories like this one. And tell us in the comments. Have you ever worked on something everybody else said was finished? The restoration took 7 months. She started with the hull, because the hull was the boat, and the boat was the hull, and everything else was just furniture. She worked from bow to stern, section by section, grinding the rust back to bare steel with a 4-inch angle grinder, the sparks flying in long orange arcs across the riverbank. Where the steel was pitted, she filled the pits with weld and ground them smooth. Where the rust had gone deep, she cut patches from steel plate she bought from a salvage yard in Athens for 40 cents a pound and welded them in place with her rod welder, running beads along the seams the way the original builders had done, overlapping them so the water had nowhere to go. Rivet sat on the deck above her while she worked, his tail hanging over the edge, watching the sparks with the focused attention of a creature that finds fire personally interesting. She applied 2 coats of rust converter to the bare steel, a chemical that turned the remaining iron oxide into a stable black compound that bonded to the surface like paint. Then, 2 coats of marine primer, gray and thick, rolled on with a foam roller and brushed into the seams with a 2-inch brush. Then 2 coats of marine enamel in matte black, the color she had chosen because it was the color of the river at night, the color of Rivet's fur, the color of something that doesn't need to be noticed to be strong. The paint went on smooth and dried hard, and when she stepped back and looked at the hull in the late afternoon light, it looked like a different vessel. It looked like something that intended to survive. The engine came next. She pulled the Detroit Diesel 671 apart piece by piece over the course of 3 weeks, labeling every bolt and bracket and gasket with masking tape and a marker. The cylinders were scored, but not cracked. She had them rebored at a machine shop in Parkersburg for $840. New pistons and rings, $620. New injectors, $380. A rebuilt fuel pump from a marine diesel supplier in Huntington, West Virginia, $275. She reassembled the engine on a Saturday in January, working in the engine room by the light of 2 clip-on work lamps, her hands black with grease, Rivet sitting on the valve cover of the reassembled engine as though he had built it himself. She primed the fuel system, checked the oil, opened the raw water seacock, and pressed the starter button at 4:17 in the afternoon. The 671 turned over twice, coughed and caught. The sound of that engine running for the first time in 37 years, a deep, steady, mechanical heartbeat that vibrated through the hull and into the ground and into Wren's chest, was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. Rivet opened one eye, flicked an ear, and went back to sleep. A woman named Pauline Mershon, who lived in a house on the bluff above the firehouse, came down one morning in November with a plate of biscuits and a thermos of coffee. She was 68, a retired nurse with white hair and a no-nonsense manner that reminded Wren of Mrs. Gunderson from Grand Marais. "I've been watching you work on that boat for 3 weeks," Pauline said, "and I decided you need to eat something that isn't gas station food." She set the plate on the deck railing and poured 2 cups of coffee without asking if Wren wanted any. She came back the next day, and the next. By December, she was coming every morning, and she and Wren would sit on the deck of the tugboat in the cold river air and drink coffee and talk about the town and the river and the people who had lived and worked along it for 200 years. A man named Darnell Oates, who ran a welding shop in Middleport, heard about the tugboat restoration and drove up one Sunday to see it. He was 54, black, built like a concrete block with 30 years of welding experience and opinions about everything metallurgical. He walked around the tugboat twice without saying a word, examined Wren's hull welds with a flashlight, and then said, "Your penetration is good, but your travel speed is too fast on the verticals. You're getting undercut. Slow down 20% and hold the arc a half-inch closer." He came back the next weekend with 50 pounds of welding rod and spent 6 hours teaching her vertical and overhead welding techniques. He never charged her $1. When she asked him why, he said, "Because I learned from a man who never charged me, and he learned from a man who never charged him, and that's how the trade works." Winter came hard along the Ohio that year. The river didn't freeze. It was too wide and too deep, and the current was too strong. But the air above it turned bitter in December and stayed that way through February. Wren worked through it. She welded in 20-degree weather with her jacket zipped to her chin and her breath hanging in white clouds that mixed with the welding smoke. The steel was so cold some mornings that her bare hand stuck to it when she forgot her gloves. She rigged a propane heater in the engine room and worked there when the wind off the river was too much, rebuilding the electrical system wire by wire, running marine-grade cable through conduit she bent by hand, soldering connections with a butane torch. Rivet stayed inside on the coldest days, curled on the captain's chair, but on the milder ones, he sat on the deck and watched Wren work with the patient alertness of a foreman who trusts his crew but wants to be certain. A retired river pilot named Claude Burgess, 81 years old, who had pushed barges on the Ohio for 44 years, came down to the riverbank one afternoon and stood looking at the tugboat for a long time. He had known Vernon Boatwright. He had known the Constance T. when she was working. "She was a good boat," Claude said. "Pushed a 6-barge tow with that 671 and never strained. Vernon kept her right." He paused. "You know Vernon's grandfather, Cyrus. People said he was dishonest, but I knew Vernon, and Vernon was the most honest man on the river. Whatever Cyrus did, Vernon didn't know about it. He just loved that boat." Claude came back several times. He told Wren stories about the river, about the floods of 64 and 97, about the night a barge broke loose above the racing locks and took out 200 feet of dock, about the time a paddle-wheel steamer from a museum in Cincinnati got stuck on a sandbar and the whole town came out to watch. He never mentioned the silver. Wren never brought it up. By May, the tugboat was done. The hull was matte black and solid. The engine ran clean. The wheelhouse had new glass in every window and a rebuilt helm with a functioning compass and a marine radio she bought used from a shop in Huntington for $85. She had rebuilt the galley with a propane stove and a small refrigerator that ran on the generator. She had built a sleeping berth in the forward compartment with a proper mattress and cedar-lined storage underneath. She had refinished the deck with non-skid paint. She kept the 2 silver bars in a locked box beneath the berth, next to a photograph of Niels Lindgren standing in his workshop in 2 harbors, and the braided leather bracelet she still wore every day. Spring came the way it comes, along the Ohio River. Slow at first, then all at once. The hills going from gray to pale green to deep emerald in the space of 3 weeks. Dogwood bloomed white in the understory. Redbuds turned the hillsides purple. The river rose with snowmelt from the mountains to the east, and then fell again, leaving a dark waterline on the dock pilings like a memory of something that had passed through. Wren finished the last of the interior work in April, building shelves into the wheelhouse for books and tools, installing a small wood-burning stove she found at a farm auction in Meigs County for $35, laying down a piece of salvaged carpet in the sleeping berth that made Rivet knead with his paws every time he walked across it. She launched the Constance T. on a Tuesday morning in May. Virgil and Pauline and Darnell and Claude and a dozen other people from Racine stood on the bank and watched as the come-along winch eased the tugboat down the muddy slope and into the Ohio River for the first time in 37 years. The hull settled into the brown water and floated level and true. Wren climbed aboard and started the engine. The 671 caught on the first press of the starter and settled into its deep, steady rhythm. She eased the throttle forward. The propeller bit. The Constance T. moved. Rivet was sitting on the captain's chair in the wheelhouse, tail curled around his paws, looking out through the new glass at the river ahead with the calm certainty of a creature that had always known this was coming. Virgil stood on the bank with his arms crossed and his Cincinnati Reds cap pushed back on his head and said nothing for a long time. Then he nodded once, slowly, the way he did when something met a standard he hadn't told you about. Pauline was crying. She didn't try to hide it. Darnell was grinning with his arms folded, shaking his head. Claude Burgess, who had not shown emotion in Wren's presence before, took off his hat and held it against his chest, and watched the Constance T pull away from the bank, and said quietly to no one in particular, "Vernon would have liked that." That evening, Wren tied the Constance T to the municipal dock at Racine, and sat on the stern deck with her feet hanging over the water. The Ohio River was wide and brown and patient, flowing the way it had flowed for 10,000 years, carrying whatever was placed upon it without complaint. The hills on the West Virginia side were dark green and steep, catching the last of the sunlight at their ridges. A barge tow passed downriver, pushing 12 barges of coal, the diesel engine thrumming in the distance. The wake from the tow rocked the Constance T gently, and Wren felt the boat move beneath her the way you feel a horse breathe when you're sitting on it. Alive, present, holding you. Rivet appeared from the wheelhouse and walked along the gunwale with the impossible confidence of a cat who has never once considered the possibility of falling. He jumped onto Wren's lap and settled there, purring, his body warm against her legs, his yellow-green eyes half-closed. She thought about Cyrus Boatwright, a man who had poured silver in secret and hidden it in the hull of a tugboat he would never see again. She thought about Vernon Boatwright, who had loved the boat without knowing what was inside it. She thought about Niels Lindgren, who had taught her that fitting two things together the right way means they hold without glue or screws. She thought about Rivet, who had jumped through a truck window in a gas station parking lot and decided, without being asked, that he belonged. That's the thing about the things we carry. Most of them we never chose. The bracelet on her wrist, the cat on her lap, the silver in the hold, the knowledge in her hands. They came to her the way the river comes to the sea, not because it decided to, but because the shape of the land made it inevitable. You don't choose the current. You learn to read it. And if you're patient, and if you're paying attention, it carries you somewhere worth being. By summer, she had a routine. She woke at dawn to the sound of the river and the birds in the sycamore trees along the bank. She made coffee on the propane stove and drank it on the stern deck while Rivet sat on the gunwale and watched the water. She spent the mornings doing small repair jobs for people along the river, welding a broken gate for a farmer in Letarte, fixing a leaky water heater for Pauline, rebuilding the dock cleats at the municipal landing. Virgil paid her $15 an hour from the town maintenance fund for the dock work, and the farmer paid her in cash and sweet corn and a standing invitation to Sunday dinner. In the afternoons, she read. She had filled the wheelhouse shelves with books from the library in Pomeroy and the used bookstore in Gallipolis, books about river history and metallurgy and diesel mechanics, and a worn paperback of Mark Twain's life on the Mississippi that she read twice in 3 weeks. In the evenings, she sat on the deck and watched the light change on the hills across the river, and listened to the sound of the current against the hull, and felt, for the first time since she had left Minnesota, that she was somewhere she was meant to be. She didn't need the tugboat to go anywhere. Some boats are built for distance. This one was built for staying, for holding ground against the current, for keeping things in place. Wren Calloway was 20 years old and broke. She had $10 to her name, and she spent it on a rusted tugboat on the Ohio River. It was the best $10 she ever spent. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell us in the comments, have you ever found something hidden in plain sight that changed how you saw where you were? We'd love to hear your story. See you in the next one.